is also known as Human Trafficking Awareness Month. It is a key time for us all as individuals to educate ourselves about human trafficking and, crucially, to learn to spot the signs of trafficking. It is also a time for us to take these messages to our workplaces, our churches, our schools, our representatives, and everywhere else. At Hope for Justice, we investigate cases of human trafficking and work closely with law enforcement to rescue victims and ensure evidence is gathered against perpetrators to see them brought to justice. Our team of investigators is drawn from some of the most respected and prestigious law enforcement agencies in the country. During this month, Hope for Justice partnered with the Links Inc., bringing together a panel of experts from Epic Girl, Lily Pad Haven, Rescue One Global, and the Davidson County District Attorney's Office to discuss human trafficking.
My name is Jacobia Dow. I have the pleasure of serving as our National Trends and Services Chair with the Music City chapter of the Links Incorporated. We are an international organization of ladies that are committed to friendship and service in our community. And we are partnering with Hope for Justice and other groups this morning to host this human and sex traffic awareness session. I'm going to turn it over to our president to give our official greeting, and then we will move promptly into the training. But thank you again for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jacobia, and thank you to all of you all who are participating today. I think I heard someone earlier say Happy New Year, so let me say it to everyone as well. Happy New Year. This is, I tell you what, exciting. I think some people are still have their phone not on mute. If you could put them on mute.
You're back.
You're building upon the painting. You're keeping it going.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep going. I just want to say thank you all for coming and joining us today. We left out of 2020, which was a year that no one could ever see coming. And so many things collapsed, so many things stopped, so many things didn't continue to go on, revenue stopped. However, we know that trafficking continue to go forward. And that's something that we are here today to talk about because it is still prevalent in our day and time. So I want to thank Hope for Justice. I want to thank all of our Links sisters. I want to thank the Music City Links chapter and our sisters there. I want to thank our community partners who have come together to link with us so that we could bring awareness and education to this situation that takes place in our communities. We know that a lot of Black and Brown children, a lot of Black and Brown community members are the ones who are really targeted with human trafficking and sex trafficking. So I think it's important that we learn more about ways in which we can be a voice for those who are voiceless or appear to be voiceless. And then one other thing I want to say, there are some faith-based people who are on here today. I want to say that to you all as well. This is an area or partner that we really need to link up with and really stand strong in because it's moving into that community as well. And as a minister, I am committed to make sure that faith-based organizations continue to speak out, continue to stand up for those who seem like they don't have hope and don't have a voice. So I want to thank Link Jacobia, the chair of our National Trends and Services, to all of our partners and to Hope for Justice for making sure that we have a platform where we can learn more of how to be great stewards and great advocates for those persons who are not able to speak on their behalf, and we can speak for them. Thank you so much, Link Jacobia.
Misa, thank you for kicking this off for us. You and Jacobia really appreciate the opportunity to partner with Links, but also to partner with our coalition of panel discussion experts with Stacia Freeman from Epic Girl, Dr. Kelly Clunan from Chamberlain, who also works as a volunteer for Hope, Benjinas Jenkins with Lily Pad Haven, Lacey Toller with Rescue One Global, and Sarah Wilson, who is the district attorney specifically designated for human trafficking cases in Davidson County. It's a great opportunity for all of us to form together with a panel with so much knowledge and experience to deliver that to the community so everybody understands. We know that awareness can save lives, and that's what we're trying to deliver today through this coalition of experts, is a panel discussion to deliver deliver some awareness. And we know that awareness will lead to rescues in the aspect of that. I'll introduce each panel member as we get to them, but I'm going to start off a little bit with some statistics-based information. Hope for Justice is an international nonprofit, works on 4 continents. We have multiple offices. Our headquarters here is in Nashville, Tennessee, hence why we work together with this group to try to combat trafficking. Sex trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion in an effort to sexually exploit somebody. Not only is it a travesty, a human rights violation, crime, but also I think somebody had jumped on. What I want to talk about is to emphasize the importance and the global statistics that fall around human trafficking and the importance of raising this awareness. Thousands of people are being exploited globally. We know that human trafficking is a $150 billion a year business. Most people think to themselves, how can it be that much money? How can people make that much money off of the travesty of selling another human being? When you think about how come human trafficking is the second fastest growing crime globally, you can only sell that drug once, but you can resell that victim over and over and over again. There's an estimated 25 million victims of human trafficking across the globe. The National Human Trafficking Hotline last year estimated that there was a 20% increase from the previous year in human trafficking calls. In Tennessee alone, there were 180 cases reported of human trafficking just in Tennessee. And despite the misconception, there are actually more U.S. citizens being trafficked in the United States than illegal immigrants. So when we talk about this, the harsh reality, though, is that human trafficking really hits our most vulnerable. And some of our most vulnerable are our young adults. Okay. And when we talk about young adults, they are even in a more vulnerable time right now, given the COVID pandemic. When we look how much the COVID pandemic has burdened society in general, those who are most susceptible are the most vulnerable to being trafficked within COVID-19. Right now, we are seeing more and more children. 156 billion students globally are now being educated online. And when we talk about online exploitation and we talk about the connection to COVID and we talk about the vulnerability of our youth and vulnerabilities of people to COVID, most people say, how can youths and adolescents spend any more time online than they already do? Most of the time when you look at a youth or an adolescent, they're glued to their cell phone or they're glued to their computer. But now we know from statistics that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children said that over the course of the pandemic, online reports of online exploitation doubled from 2 million reports to 4.2 million reports over the course of the pandemic. That figure blew me away when I looked at it. I couldn't believe it. Another thing that places our youth and adolescents vulnerable during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is the fact that they go also unidentified. Most children now are at home learning, and because they're at home learning, they're under less supervision. We don't have educators watching and monitoring what they're looking at online. Most parents, if they're able, are actually home working from remote situations and don't have the opportunity to observe their children while they're online, giving traffickers more of an opportunity to cruise online platforms and look for vulnerabilities of these children. Another thing that it adds to is healthcare situations. We'll also talk about that. There are fewer and fewer people going to healthcare settings and clinical settings because those centers are now overwhelmed with the COVID pandemic and don't have the opportunity now as much to identify those people who may be in a trafficking situation. So when we talk about this, when we talk about the vulnerabilities of trafficking, we have to look at the variables that cause these vulnerabilities and make sure that we better protect those vulnerabilities. And while we're on the topic of youth and the vulnerabilities of our young young youth. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Stacia Freeman, who is the CEO and founder of Epic Girl, which is a program here based in Nashville that is implemented to prevent negative outcomes such as trafficking through education and mentoring. Stacia has over 15 years of nonprofit leadership, mainly focused in the anti-trafficking and youth empowerment area. She founded the safety and risk assessment tool used to screen and identify high-risk teenagers for exploitation. Epic Girl has screened over 1,100 teen runaways, and we know from statistics that runaways and homeless individuals are extremely vulnerable to trafficking because they have to resort to survival sex. In fact, some of the statistics suggest that 1 in 3 runaways is sexually exploited and trafficked. In addition to Epic Girl, Stacia has consulted with JFAM and the Centoya Brown Long on the Glitter Project. This project was developed in an effort to dispel the myths around trafficking and the cultural concepts based on Ms. Long's experience as a young victim of trafficking, trapped in a broken criminal justice system. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Stacia Freeman to discuss.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all, even if it is remotely. I'm happy to be here. As Richard said, I started Epic Girl and I ran a pilot project in 2015 because I was very concerned about youth vulnerability. I had worked in anti-trafficking both internationally and domestically, and had recognized that we had some gaps in the way that we were raising awareness, and also in the way that we were educating specifically those affected by issues such as trafficking. And so really I founded Epic Girl as a means to educate, and worked with the juvenile court system to develop tools and programs that would build strength and empowerment for specifically girls, so that they wouldn't become a victim of anything. I'll be honest with you, when I first started, my main goal was to just educate and refer. I just thought, I'm a mom first, and I know how resilient kids can be and how smart they can be. And through, 10 years of interviewing victims, the one thing that I had heard consistently was that they did not know the ways to stay safe from something like trafficking. And there's a lot of misconceptions around the issue as well. And so in starting that, I just wanted to work with the court to educate girls that were coming into the court system. In 2015, we saw about 317 girls. And just every girl that came in through the court system, except for delinquent charges. At that time, we were not seeing delinquent charges, and we're not working specifically in the detention center. And we just educated them on what is trafficking, what does a pimp look like, how does someone become a victim of trafficking, what is vulnerability, how can your vulnerabilities put you at higher risk for something like trafficking. And then we would give the girls a survey and ask them to circle or, identify on the form what additional services that they may need. And pretty early into it, I had a young girl wait for me after the class and say that she appreciated the class and she knew that she really needed access to all of the services that we were offering to connect her to. But what she really liked was the connection that she felt in the class. And so she said, when can we do this again? And I was kind of like, oh no, I had not anticipated this at all. But that kind of led us into moving out of the idea of just being this educational forum and moving more into relationship, when I started to think back to all of the victims that I had served in the 10 years of anti-trafficking work, and remembering that the catalyst that really kind of broke them out of some of the entrapments from trafficking were consistent, healthy relationships. And so Epic Girl was founded on the basis that consistent, healthy relationship is really what drives change. We do have the educational component. We have evolved. In 2017. We were asked by the Administrative Office of the Court to develop a tool specifically for identification of trafficking victims, and worked in Tennessee with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Children's Services, the Administrative Office of the Court, including the juvenile court, and Vanderbilt to identify a tool and to analyze data. And I'm going to share a little bit of that data with you. But I will say I did appreciate what your president said about recognizing that a large number of the girls that are affected by trafficking and exploitation are Black and brown girls. And you'll see from my data that the largest majority of girls that we're serving at Epic Girl are girls of color. And when I first came into anti-trafficking in 2008, a lot of the marketing tools around raising awareness were focused on white girls, which perpetuated a lot of the myths that girls are snatched off the street, stuffed into the back of white vans, and taken to other countries. And then there's also the use of the word slavery a lot, which working in this field for almost 16 years, I understand why we use that and why it pertains to this issue. But I think as a group of professionals working to change the narrative around trafficking and exploitation, we also have to recognize that words like that can have sensitivity for certain cultures and can also really affect a girl's ability to come forth and tell what's happened to her, because in the majority of cases, they aren't being trafficked by strangers. They're being exploited by people that they know, and oftentimes they're being exploited by people that they think love them. And so I was really happy to hear you mention that, and I think that it's going to require a lot of additional work on the part of all of us to look at marketing tools that represent the whole of the populations that are being exploited and give everyone a voice, and to use words that are understandable. Richard mentioned fraud, force, and coercion, but in Tennessee specifically, we have a law, which I know Sarah will talk about, that looks at anything of value that's exchanged can be considered trafficking, which gets a lot of us into splitting hairs over survival sex, as Richard also mentioned, versus, someone being forced, to do something and their papers taken away and their right to leave taken away. And in the majority of cases that I'm seeing, girls can come and go as they want to. And so there's that added part of choice. And so they feel like, well, I chose to stay, or I didn't have any place to go, so I stayed there and they took care of me, and maybe the way that they took care of me was better than my own family took care of me. So it's not an issue of slavery, it's not an issue of force. I really wasn't even coerced. So I think that there's a challenge to all of us that want to make a difference in this field to look at the vocabulary and things like that. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm also going to put on my glasses because I'm quite blind without them. And I'm going to pop up is this working now? You all can see that. So the basis of Epic Girl is EPIC is empowerment through education, basically following the premise that we don't know what we don't know, and that kids are very resilient and very able to make good choices if they're given the right tools and the right information. And one thing that we do through the screening tool is we ask every girl that we screen, have you ever heard of sex trafficking? And about 95% of them say yes. And then we say, okay, what is your definition? How would you explain it if you were explaining it? The number one explanation that we get is kidnapping. And so there really is that idea among teenage girls from social media, from pop culture, from television, that trafficking involves white vans and kidnapping, which again can form their foundation for what that looks like, and does it pertain to them. Then we really try to connect girls to their purpose, teaching them that their power lies in their purpose, and we work a lot on breaking cycles and talking about individual identity discovery, which makes us dive in pretty deeply into social media, the way this population of youth uses social media. As Richard mentioned, the the pandemic has really increased the amount of time that kids are online. And, girls today are really defining themselves. I know, especially all of us. I mean, for women, I find myself sometimes comparing myself to other women, looking at their houses are cleaner, their kids are nicer, their vacations are better, they're eating healthier. And if that becomes an issue for me, we can imagine how the self-esteem of a young person can be affected, especially a young person that may already be living in a very vulnerable situation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the connection through community is the most important part to drive change for the girls that we serve. So the way that it works is about 90% of our kids come through juvenile court. A lot of the early laws looking at trafficking and exploitation really excluded juvenile court and did not include often those early laws didn't even include child welfare. And in Tennessee, some of our laws were kind of snuck in, and child welfare and juvenile court and people like that weren't included to look at how meaningful the law was. So I'll give you an example. We moved, when I first started seeing minors that were runaways through the detention center, the first time I ever got called to the detention center was 2008 for a youth that had run away from Chicago, Illinois. And they held her for 10 days as a runaway because they were really trying to get a handle on what was going on. Was she safe? And I was able to go in as much as I wanted to and talk to her and build rapport and kind of put a story around what was going on. She was a kid that her mother had been incarcerated. She was living with an elderly grandmother, and grandmother really couldn't take care of her and provide for her. Plus she had the grief and the things like that were going on. And she had run and connected to a pimp on the streets and had been brought to Nashville. And, we were really able to establish rapport with her. The challenge now becomes that when the law was passed and we moved quite nobly in the direction of seeing, girls that are victims of trafficking as victims instead of as, trying to penalize them for that. We can only hold them now as runaways for 3 to 4 hours. So as someone that goes in and sees youth, it makes it very difficult for us to build rapport and to convince them to reach out to us if they get into a bind or if they need someone to help them figure things out, especially the girls from out of state. We don't have time at all to build rapport with them or to really figure out what's going on. So a law that was very much intentioned to help girls and to see them as victims, actually for some of the most hard to serve girls has made it more difficult for us to serve them. So and Richard, please tell me when I'm getting close on time, because I know I'll start talking and then you'll be like, so just wave your hand at me. We used to see every girl that had court involvement, but there is a trend in juvenile justice to look at diversion away from the court system, because we know that kids with low-level offenses like shoplifting, minor possession, runaway would be one of those, that we don't want to get those girls more tangled up into a court system that might increase their risk for greater court involvement. And so we are trying to move them away from the court system and give them access to programming that hopefully will prevent them from becoming further court involved or further system involved. So Epic Girl went from seeing every girl that was involved in the court system to only seeing the most high risk. And in 2018, we started seeing the delinquent girls as well. So we've seen every girl in Davidson County since 2018 that has been charged with murder. And so it's great because a lot of the girls in the delinquent juvenile justice system are at very high risk for trafficking, but it means that other agencies are really going to have to step in and do some of the really strong prevention work that we were doing in the beginning, because there's about, you'll see when I show you the numbers, there's about 35% of the population that we see as runaways that aren't being served by Epic Girl. So the idea is they come in, they're screened through the runaway interviews, they attend classes, build rapport, and then they're connected to mentors. And then once they connect with mentors, there's really the opportunity is for them to connect to community. And we give them endless opportunities to connect and to stay connected, whether it's through their youth service support, their case manager, or through their mentor And we use a dual mentor program, which I'm happy to talk to anyone about that may be local. Because of COVID, we're doing everything online, so it makes it easier for people out of area that might want to mentor girls. From 2018 to 2019, our girls are divided into risk level, with level 1 being the low risk girls, level 2 being mid risk, and level 3 being the high risk girls, which is where you're going to see the trafficking girls. And out of that 239, about 113 attended our overall identity class, which is that kind of safety class. And now, as you would see, there would be about 76 girls that would not have access to our services. So it's still a large number of girls that we're serving, but that 76 girls would need access to some other program to build support within them. And from 2017 to 2018, we saw about 373 girls, and you can see our ethnic breakdown, with over 52% of our girls being African American and another 17% being Hispanic and 9% being biracial. So it does show you that the bulk of the girls that we're seeing that fall into that vulnerable category, that are running away, that are engaging in behaviors that are dangerous to them, dangerous for our community, are Black and brown girls that maybe, have not in the past had a voice, or it's been more difficult for them to connect. We used to look at citizenship status. We don't look at that anymore, obviously. And then looking at some of the pre and post data for COVID, when you're looking at the breakdown of girls, you'll see that prior to COVID lockdown, only about 20% of our girls were girls that we would have called level 3 or extremely high risk girls. And now from March to current, I only have data through August, 50% of the girls fall into the highest risk. What we're also seeing is that there's a fair number of repeat screens. So we see those consistent runners. Like from March to current, we had one youth in particular that we saw 17 times for runaway. So as Richard mentioned, the most vulnerable, the highest risk girls are having the hardest time with some of this. It's interesting. We did a very small scale study with Metro Nashville to look at the increase of stress for COVID. Happy to share that data specifically with anyone if you'll reach out to me. But what we saw was a lot of the girls that we were screening as part of the runaway screening for increased stress due to COVID were saying, I have so much stress. I didn't even really notice there was additional stress. It just felt like one more thing to deal with. And so it's just like putting so much more pressure on them. But the number one thing that they did report that was a problem was the online education. And a lot of them were getting additional supports through school, and that sort of went away. So we also saw an increase in the number of kids that are involved in DCS. It's about 50-50 now, and DCS involvement does increase risk. So just going back to that leveling system that we talked about, that I talked about, the 5 things that really categorize a high risk kid for us when we're looking at screening is if they have DCS involvement, because when a kid is running from DCS, you can almost always assume that there's some level of exploitation happening, whether it's exploitation through drugs or gang affiliation, but some form of exploitation is generally occurring. So DCS involvement, a delinquent charge, gang affiliation, they disclose trafficking, or they've run away more than 5 times or been gone longer than 2 weeks, we consider that to be high risk for exploitation. So those girls would automatically be considered level 3. The difference between level 1 and level 2 girls is their acknowledgement of having a healthy support in place, because if you haven't done ACEs training and you're interested in ACEs as adverse childhood experiences, and you're interested in understanding vulnerability with youth and how vulnerability affects our community, the one thing that really builds a buffer for girls or boys or people in general of falling over the cliff with adverse childhood experiences is the connection of healthy supportive relationships. So I would encourage you to go through ACEs training if that's something you're interested in. But we really differentiate between low-level risk and high-level risk based on their connection to healthy relationships. So I know I'm running out of time. I will say that I have been fortunate enough to work with Centoya over the past, when she was still incarcerated, supporting her and working with her on the Glitter Project. And there's some amazing programs coming out that she's helped develop, that she's using a lot of youth that I've worked with to help direct policies around serving youth and around getting programs and materials into the hands of all girls and boys through the school system to educate them on what really is trafficking and exploitation. So hopefully soon you'll see some more information on the Glitter Project, and I encourage you to to be a part of that and to raise awareness in your community using some of those programs as they're rolled out. So I think that's all. Thank you for having me. I'm grateful to be here, and I'll be happy to answer questions when it's time for that.
Stacey, thanks so much for that informative piece. One of the topics that you had brought up is the runaways, and sometimes we are often concerned that, when they're running away from a situation that may be worse and we're returning them to that situation that was probably a worst case scenario from when they were on the streets, and now they become an habitual runaway and get lost in the cycle in the system. And then those are the ones that kind of fall through the cracks. I mean, would you agree that that's probably the most vulnerable that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a real issue right now with us deciding how we're going to handle runaways going forward, because when they come into there, we think that child welfare is magic and makes everything better. But what we see is that when they go into child welfare, they actually increase their vulnerability a lot of times. So, I mean, we need more placements, not only just for trafficking victims, but also just for vulnerable runaways. And so there's a lot of issues with how we're serving runaways and what types of resources we have in place, and the fact that we do first time up to maybe 5 to 10 times we'll release them back to their family member, especially if they're not reporting that there's a problem in the home.
It's unfortunate, but it does come down to resources and the lack of. So our next panelist is Dr. Kelly Clunan. Kelly volunteers with Hope for Justice and with spreading clinical awareness in regards to trafficking. She is a nurse educator. She's also assistant dean and professor at Chamberlain University. She's delivered training on clinical human trafficking awareness to thousands of people with the Department of State at embassies abroad and also here in the U.S. So I'd like to welcome Kelly to the panel for discussion.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be with you guys, and I love working with Hope for Justice. It's been an amazing experience for me. And, just identifying victims in the healthcare setting, and it kind of goes along with what you were talking about with the other programs. And one thing I want to share with you guys today, and if you guys are a healthcare provider on this call, one thing I want to say just right at the front, if you would like some of these screening tools that we have, I'm happy to share those with you, or Richard can as well. And one thing, some of these screenings, you don't even have to be a healthcare provider. So I'd like you guys to hear what I have to say. And, even if you're not a healthcare provider, just listen to it, because these things that you may identify wherever you're working, if you're in a childcare setting, if you have, kids coming over to play with your kids, if you have whatever situation, some of these things can still translate. I'm going to talk a bit about identification in the healthcare setting and some clinical considerations when working with trafficking victims, and how you can help them through that process when you do identify a potential victim. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So the reason this is important is because up to 80% of trafficking victims are seen by a healthcare provider during their time in captivity. So that is huge. That is a really serious missed opportunity for intervention. So as a healthcare provider, it's a really unique position to be in, to identify victims of trafficking and provide help to them, both psychological and physical, during captivity and after. So as you know, even in any setting, victims don't identify themselves as victims, right? They don't come out and say, hey, I'm a victim of human trafficking. So it can be very difficult to recognize them. And one focus on children in particular in the healthcare setting is we should be removing them from the adult they're with at some point when they're an adolescent and asking them if they're safe and being able to identify some of these things. So I want to point that out as well. So the health problems you're going to see in victims of trafficking that you should be aware of are largely a result of deprivation of food and sleep, extreme stress, as was just mentioned, hazards of travel, violence, both physical and sexual, and hazardous work. And a lot of times victims don't have timely access to healthcare by the time they reach a clinician. So you may see well-advanced health problems that normally would be taken care of early on. And so that's a red flag. And, victims also are at high risk for acquiring multiple sexually transmitted infections and multiple forced and unsafe abortions. Physical abuse and torture often occur. So you want to look at some of those typical signs of abuse like broken bones, contusions, loss of teeth, cigarette burns, things like that, things that maybe come up on an x-ray that you could tell the bones were broken at one point. So typical signs of normal physical abuse. Often victims report anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and corresponding psychological symptoms like aggression, shame, guilt, sleep disturbance, suicidal thoughts, those kind of things. And, be aware, this is something that's been interesting to me the more I've learned about human trafficking. The client may come in intoxicated, withdrawing, maybe even drug seeking. And sometimes that can be overlooked as, oh, they're doing drugs, they're on the street and they're doing all this by choice. It may not be. So keep that in mind that some traffickers actually use that to draw their victims in and keep them coming back for more and forcing them to stay with them because they're addicted to whatever drug they're supplying them. So just keep that in mind. It can also cause, some elevated emotions. You can also see the opposite, dissociation. So maybe the person appears to be in a trance or just unemotional and just kind of, zoned out when you're talking to them. So, symptoms of psychological trauma, of minimization, denial, and memory loss can make it really difficult to get information from the victim. So what you may actually get is an inconsistent story. You may hear from the victim one story, and then maybe at some point law enforcement is brought in and they're telling them a different story. Do not take this as they're not telling the truth. It could be just a result of trauma, which I know someone's talking about that a bit more later, so I won't go too much into it. And, review the red flags checklist to view many of these signs. Hope for Justice has awesome tools with identifying the red flags and looking for these things in victims. So I highly suggest everyone on this call look at that, again, if you're in healthcare or not, just to identify victims and possible situations that you may not have thought of before and say, that's kind of weird. Sometimes I would argue too that just your gut feeling of, hey, that seems off. Don't ignore that. Pay attention to it, look into it a little bit more. So, when we do find somebody, so say you've identified somebody that you believe is a victim, it's really important to effectively screen them. Okay, you want to decrease their fear, build rapport. Even as the person right before me was just talking, saying, that's hard sometimes. You don't have a lot of time, but you can't act like you don't. You have to be there and show that you do have time for them. And some tips for doing that, make sure that you fulfill basic needs for people right away. So if any of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you really need those basic needs first. Some temporary shelter, food, clothing, things like that. If needed, use a competent, trustworthy interpreter. So if the English isn't the first language, make sure you're using an interpreter. This can really be the difference by identifying a victim of trafficking or not being able to because they can't communicate that to you. Make sure to hold the interview in a non-threatening location. Never interview the victim or talk to the victim within sight of the trafficker. And so if the victim arrives with somebody who has really controlling behavior, you want to make sure to talk to the victim in private. I touched on this a few minutes ago. And I go back to a time when I was a pediatric nurse, so I worked in different outpatient clinics and inpatient. And I had this one patient at one point. She was a very young girl. She had come in multiple times to be treated for sexually transmitted infections, and her mom, I'm going to put that in quotation marks, was starting her on birth control. The girl was 13 or 14. She was very young. And I remember thinking, and I'm just going to be truthful in this discussion, I remember thinking, gosh, what is this mom doing, not making sure her daughter's in some after school program or something, because clearly she's coming home, because the mom said, well, I work. And so she comes home for a few hours, before I get home, and she's home alone. And this is when these things happen, and she's just off with these boys and whatever. And, in hindsight at the time, I did not know about human trafficking. I had not known about Hope for Justice or any of it. And I just thought, man, this mom needs to care more, right? And that was my intention and thought. And when I look back at that, I just think about, was that actually a handler or somebody working with the trafficker, not even this girl's mom? And I remember the girl was in a trance-like state. She was very unemotional about it. She didn't care. She didn't respond much. The mom did. She didn't have any other signs of abuse. If she had, I would have noticed that. In healthcare or childcare, we're taught to identify physical abuse, right? And sometimes it's obvious in a traffic victim, sometimes it's not. So I will never know in that situation, but I think back to that of just something being off. And so I just say to you, separate any teen, younger children, sometimes we're not allowed to in healthcare, but as kids get older, even if you don't recognize a symptom, take a moment to speak to that teen alone. Where I worked, I'm in the Cleveland, Ohio area, and where I worked, it was required actually. If you wanted your child seen in our clinic, we had to allow for a few minutes of separation, just ask a few questions. So I just want to drive that home, because it's one of those things that, stay with you when you think back. And I'd urge you to do that too. Think back to situations. Was there ever a time where maybe there was something going on, not to use it as something to feel terrible about, but to guide you for the future, to not ignore those things. Okay, a couple other tips is to maintain a verbally neutral stance towards the trafficker. So this could, again, be used any which way, in healthcare or not. When you're talking about the trafficker, be neutral. Don't say, oh, what a jerk and what a horrible person, because what actually might happen with this victim mentality and trauma is that person may actually come in and defend that trafficker and say, well, no. So you have to be really careful, verbally, neutral. They're out of sight. Don't focus on that. Otherwise it really is perceived as a threat. Don't rush the client. Give them time to pause, explain that's okay. You're not in a hurry. Offer to repeat anything that they need to hear again. And the one thing too is, again, I talk about this checklist and screening because I really think these are awesome tools and they're free to you. I just want to make that clear from Hope for Justice. Periodically review the red flags checklist and the screening questions, either that your organization uses, or again, you're welcome to use ours. Because then if you're really familiar with those signs, the more familiar you are, the more confident you'll be during a screening, and you'll probably be able to get more information from the victim if you're able to convey a comfortable, confident attitude. You want to be sensitive to their needs, and you want to use non-threatening questions. So again, an example from one of our tools of an example of this type of questioning is it would say something like this. Sometimes people do unfair, unsafe, or even dangerous work or stay in a dangerous situation because if they don't, someone might hurt them or someone they love. Have you ever experienced this, or are you in a situation where you think this could happen? So this is just one of those ways that we use a question that's kind of, it's not, hey, is someone hurting you? Are you in this terrible situation? It's more like, hey, sometimes this happens and, or you think it could happen. Are you in this situation? It's just kind of that more casual, less threatening manner. And then also, if somebody does say, yes, I am, that is something, you want to express prior knowledge. You don't want to act shocked or surprised, like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. You want to be sympathetic for them, and you want to be caring and kind, but you don't want to appear surprised by anything they're telling you, okay? You want to make it seem like, yes, I've heard of this happening before. I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. I'm here to help you. And that's kind of a really important approach because it might scare them away if they feel like this is your first rodeo, okay? So number one thing too, please be careful to not imply that the victim was responsible for their own abuse or exploitation. They may not be able to leave the trafficking situation that was just already discussed on this call. It might be because of money. It might be because that person's providing them with food. It might be that they're threatening their family. It might be their family putting them through this exploitation. And, as mentioned, someone they love. So please let them know that they're not to blame for this situation. And especially when we're dealing with children, it is never their fault. They are never, they may be forced to do crimes while they're being trafficked. And so, just let them know that is, it's not their fault. It was through force. So that's an important point as well. So, you may be the first person, just as a reminder to, as a clinician, we realize that 80%, as I mentioned at the beginning, are seen by a healthcare provider while they're being trafficked. So you may be the first person that this victim is expressing this trauma to. So just be understanding. They may not want to repeat details. So be sensitive to that. It can actually cause re-traumatization. So just keep that in mind. And also remember that victims who have been trafficked have experienced oppression and have had all control taken from them by their trafficker. So you want to offer as much control as possible during the screening to build that trust. So you want to make sure to not overshadow the client. Sometimes those of us in helping professions know we want to take over and do all the things for our patients and our clients to help them get to what they need, and we want to fix everything, right? But you want to make sure to have them join you. So maybe if you're calling a hotline, you want to have them call with you, do it together. Let them set the pace for the screening. Let them decline to answer. If they don't want to answer one of your questions, that's okay. You want to really allow them to be part of that decision-making process. And that's really a key component to survival-centered practice. And it really helps the victim to know that their needs, their wishes, their desires are important and they're valued. And that hasn't been for them for a long time. So it's important to make sure that we allow them to feel that way. So I appreciate your time. And then I just hope you'll remember that being aware and attentive to these signs can really help you identify a victim of human trafficking and lead them to safety. And organizations like Hope for Justice are a great place. I love that I know that I could call Hope for Justice and say, hey, I saw this sign on the side of the road asking for, workers. There was no business. Can you look into it? I'm not an investigator. Some days I wish I were because my passion for this is growing day by day, but I'm not. And Richard has taught me that to take the skills you have and the knowledge you have and use that to help someone. So I hope this was helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions. And I know there'll be questions at the end too. And I just thank you for your time and letting me share.
Kelly, before you get off, thanks for sharing that information with us. But, this week I was actually contacted by a SANE department, sexual assault nurse examiner unit at a hospital. And they were talking about a victim that they had come in that did not want to go forward to law enforcement and was asking for some advice in regards to this, but they didn't recognize this victim as a trafficking victim. This victim came forward and told them that they were a trafficking victim. And she went on to explain to me, I wish we had more training in human trafficking. And I said, well, how much training have you had? And she says, none of the nurses here, we're all SANE certified, but none of us have had any human trafficking training. Does that surprise you in the healthcare setting?
It does not. And I could tell you that. So I work at a university where I teach online as well. So we actually have to get various nursing licenses across the country in order to teach students from those states. And recently I learned that I think it's New York actually requires a human trafficking continuing education credit. So it's beginning to become a thing, but in Ohio, that's why I knew nothing about it years ago. It does not surprise me. There's no training. And that's why I think trainings like this are so important and to continue. And that's why if any of you are in healthcare and your hospital wants some training, let us know. I know Richard and I are always happy to give that training because no, it's not required. And that's why it's one of those things that aggravate me, but also drive my passion is that I want nurses to know, nurses need to know, doctors, any clinician needs to understand and have this training. I think from the receptionist that talks to people coming into a hospital all the way through that process needs to know these signs so they could help identify. But no, that does not surprise me, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, Ohio is one of the top states for trafficking. So it's kind of surprised. So our next guest we'll be talking with is Virginia Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins is the executive director of Lily Pad Haven, which is a nonprofit organization that provides transitional housing and support services for trafficking victims. She is also a licensed clinical social worker who provides family and individual therapy to families within the foster care system. We know that the foster care system is made up of a high level of vulnerability of individuals who could be trafficked. So Ms. Jenkins, thank you for joining us today on this panel. We appreciate your level of practitioner experience and expertise in this.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you to the Links for this opportunity to be here today. I'm going to echo some of the things that may have already been said, and that's fine as we talk about awareness for human trafficking. As Richard has said, and has all the information that we may know already, that human trafficking is a horrific crime, and that survivors experience multiple physical, emotional, and psychological traumas. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the physical, emotional, psychological effects of human trafficking have on victims, and then just touch a little bit about what that looked like from a program perspective.
Okay.
So again,
where are you going?
So again, human trafficking survivors experience multiple physical, emotional, and psychological traumas. Those traumas may result from a single incident or event. For example, a survivor may be a victim, may be with what we call a Romeo trafficker, and is told, "You do this one time if you love me." That could just be a one-time incident, but it's still a traumatic experience. It could be a result from a repeated exposure, chronic or ongoing event. You've done it before, you'll do it again. So kind of example, or exposure to multiple traumatic experiences that they may have experienced through their life. Like the doctor had mentioned about adverse childhood experiences, it could be ongoing sexual abuse that they may experience and continue to experience through their trafficking experience. So touching on the physical traumas of human trafficking, and some of the things that you may hear that I'm talking about may be kind of graphic. So I just want to put that out there that it might be a little graphic of some of the things and trauma that survivors experience. The traffickers use physical violence to dominate and control victims. So these tactics include starvation, beating, raping, gang rape. Victims may also experience violence and harm from their trafficker, as well as from the people who are purchasing for sex trafficking, for sex acts. Common injuries may be broken bones, concussions, burns, and also brain trauma. Victims can also experience gynecological health issues that stem from forced commercial sex acts, and also forced to use substances, leading to substance abuse. So physical, as the doctor mentioned, when survivors or victims enter the emergency room, sometimes they're not identified as victims, but it's definitely one of the traumas that it is a very traumatic experience. And some of the things that they do experience doing their forced sexual acts or even labor acts. Looking at emotional effects, emotional effects of trauma is constantly being threatened. This create a feeling of guilt or shame, blame, self-blaming, disassociation due to early chronic trauma exposure, traumatic experiences. While trafficking survivors often are challenged across areas of developmental and functioning. These challenges include significant emotional and behavior dysregulation. For example, the poor ability to manage emotions, sadness, anger, irritability, frustration, problems with attachment and relationships, learning, and distortion and self-concept, which affect their self-esteem. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychological traumas that are experienced. The psychological impact of victimization may be more severe than the physical violence. Victims typically present with various psychological symptoms of mental illness, which includes post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, panic disorders, suicidal ideation, and again, substance abuse. So again, with that physical part, it could be more than it could. Again, the physical part could be more severe than the violence of the physical act. When we think about the beating and the sexual abuse, the mental trauma that it has on a victim is a lifelong process, a lifelong time of healing and working through how to deal with the trauma and cope with the traumatic experiences of human trafficking. And when we hear about all these different acts and things that may take place doing human trafficking, so some may think or ask the question, why don't victims ask for help? And there are several reasons why a victim don't ask for help. Many victims of human trafficking often don't self-identify themselves as victims initially. Some commonly blame themselves for what has happened. In these instances, some help is not immediate. I believe it was Stacy that mentioned when a survivor or a victim is being trafficked, they may think that they're in a safe place because this is what I know. Because if I leave here, going back to my previous situation may be worse, not understanding that they may be being victimized. Again, some commonly blame themselves for what happened. There's misidentification of women and girls as willing to participate in the trade act. Some they say, well, who they're making a choice to be there. And then it crosses over into the underlying part of human trafficking versus prostitution. And then victims may not know where they are physically, location, and may not speak or understand the local language. And that doesn't mean even on a global level. That means right here in the United States, being moved from different places, drugs involved. A lot of times victims don't know where they are. There may be some language barriers. So that's just a few reasons why but we find that some of the reasons why victims may not ask for help initially. And then trafficked youth are often difficult to identify and engage in services. And that's because commercial sex economy is largely hidden. Survivors rarely acknowledge to others, especially authorities, that they are being trafficked. That fear of shame, the belief of others will not help them or support them, especially survivors who may have experienced systems, like the foster care system. They're not trusting. They don't trust the system. Survivors are fear of their own safety, the safety of their family, the loss of relationships with or the protection of their exploiter. They'll be afraid of being arrested, or there may be some issues with deportation. So those are just some of the challenges to why survivors don't come forward. Many survivors have multiple and negative contact again with the systems that they've had prior experiences with. Most victims of trafficking may suffer from one or more traumatic events that will adopt psychological techniques to cope with their trauma. For example, manipulation and working in programs and working with survivors. There are a lot of manipulation there, but like the doctor mentioned, we don't want to ever blame a victim for their trafficking. They are traumatic experiences suffered by the victims of trafficking are often complex, multiple, and can occur over a long period of time. Many individuals who are trafficked, abused, or other sexual induced events may have started long before trafficking. Again, this is where we go into the adverse childhood experiences that increase the vulnerability of individuals being trafficked. And it doesn't matter if it's female, male. Vulnerable populations, as previously mentioned, are high targets for traffickers to pull into human trafficking. So no two victims of trafficking are the same, and the impact of trafficking has among them varies. you cannot make an assumption about how individuals might react. And that comes into when we getting into talking about programming. I know the doctor mentioned as far as when victims come into the hospital, we don't want to make assumptions. We don't want to blame. That's very important. I cannot say that enough. Survivors working through emotional and past traumas can be challenging. It can be painful. And addressing it appropriately is very important so we don't re-traumatize victims. Trauma affects everyone differently and it impacts them in various areas of their lives. That's relationships, self-esteem, engaging in services. Because of what they've been through, a lot of survivors they don't want to engage in services. Being able to set goals and follow through can be an issue when we're talking about programming. Their emotional well-being is impacted, their mental and physical health. So as we get into talking about just the programming and working with survivors of human trafficking and the trauma they experience, it is very important for organizations to be trauma-informed. Trauma-informed, trauma-aware of what the survivors have been through and not generalize and make assumptions. And that also, and when we're looking at a program or agency standpoint, also the staff, making sure that staff are being self-care and also not transferring any of their trauma and being aware of secondary trauma as well. But I want to say the impact, the trauma that survivors go through impact the whole person and their families. And unfortunately, there's no shortage of individuals and families that have been impacted by human trafficking in our communities as well across the globe. Our trauma-informed program here at Lily Pad Haven assists survivors with the healing journey, providing stability and self-sufficiency, because the goal is to help survivors with the healing beyond human trafficking. So it's important to from an agency standpoint, to have collaborative efforts. One agency can't do it all. We heard Stacey talk about her organization, and it's great to have collaborative partners and making sure that we could connect survivors to the services that's going to be best for the individual. My program may not be the best program for every survivor, but working with community partners to find where we can help survivors get to help them work through their trauma and get to the other side of this horrific crime of human trafficking, so they work towards their self-sufficiency. So I just wanted to make sure that we do understand from a program part working with trauma that we empower. It's important to empower the victim of human trafficking, empower them to have a voice in their healing, and that's where informed consent comes in, that they understand what they're walking into, if they're ready and where they're at, just meeting them where they're at. Again, and not blaming and not making assumptions, because again, this is very traumatic and horrific crime that of human trafficking. So we just want to make sure that we are meeting the survivors where they are and being sensitive to their needs and helping them work through this healing process and this healing journey. So if you have any questions, just feel free. I'll wait to get those questions or just let me know. Thank you.
Ms. Jenkins, I appreciate you being a part of this, and you brought up an important topic on the trauma aspect, because what a lot of people aren't aware of is the different spectrums of trauma that these individuals go through, from physical trauma to sexual trauma to drug and alcohol. I mean, they cover the whole spectrum, and it's a very delicate situation for us, which now leads into another point that you brought up, is collaboration and all of us working together. We've been working with Rescue One Global for many years now, and fortunate to have Lacey Toller with us today to talk with us a little bit about her efforts in this coalition to combat human trafficking. Lacey is a master certified trafficking in persons educator, task force mobilizer. She is one of the founders with her husband of Rescue One Global. She witnessed firsthand, slavery in the global pandemic. overseas and has brought her mission here back to the United States. Lacey, thanks so much for your time today and joining us here. Had an opportunity to visit with Lacey this week at a human trafficking meeting earlier this week. I mean, it's like no neighborhood is safe from this. Lacey, tell us a little bit about it.
Thanks for having me. And wow, to see a room full of people like this that'll take 2 hours on a Saturday to learn about this is exciting. Those of us that live in this world 24/7, sometimes just getting people to listen is very, very important. And so thank you for taking your time today. And I was raised right here in Nashville, Tennessee, in southeast part of Nashville. And so my story started overseas, though. 12 years ago, my family moved ourselves to be missionaries on the other side of the world. And it was at that time our own 9-year-old daughter was attempted to be abducted and trafficked while we lived in Asia. Our misconception was that trafficking happened in third world countries, so that's why it was going on there. And little did we know after we came home back to Nashville 2 years later that people would begin to express to us that trafficking was happening right here in our hometown where we were born and raised. And that's when our eyes were opened and we decided that we needed to do something here and there. And so we started Rescue One Global. And 10 years ago, there were very few of us on the ground. You know, Stacia on this call, she was one of those that was out front in the very beginning. And there was just a handful of us here locally, and nationally, there wasn't very many as well. And so the things that we've learned, though, over the last decade plus, being inside the world of trafficking is that we've had to all pioneer the way. So those of us that are sitting here in front of you today, there's nobody who wrote books on how to do what we're doing. We are all writing the books as we live our lives and we forge forward into this. And so the things that you'll even hear us today will change as we all begin to evolve and grow in this world, and we'll begin to see more. But I think today those of us that have been doing this can give you a really good, solid education and feel confident where we might not have been able to feel confident 8 or 10 years ago. In what we were seeing and doing. So I'm going to focus my few minutes here today on talking about the red flags of human trafficking and also talking about shelters. And I'm going to try to share my screen. My computer is being super slow today, but if it works, it works. If it doesn't, y'all just bear with me for a second here and let's see if it works. Y'all tell me, somebody give me I won't be able to see you, but give me a thumbs up if you can see it. If you can't, oh, good. Okay,
you're
great.
good.
All right. If I can, now I've got to find the little slide thing. It's not working. All right, I'll just do it from here. How about that? So, like I said, we're Rescue One Global. We're now currently on three different places in the world where we have safe house shelters. We have prevention, rescue, restoration, facilities in all three of these countries. We're based right here in Nashville, Tennessee. We also have safe house and programs in the Philippines and in Thailand. I will say that as much as it is a problem right here in the States, and that's what we're going to focus our time talking about, it is still 10 times the problem globally. And that does affect us. But one of the biggest misconceptions that I want to dispel for a lot of people, and I try to say this quite often, is that those who are trafficked inside the U.S. come from the U.S. mainly. Very, very small portion of them come from other countries and come into our country. And so make sure that when you're thinking about trafficking, if you have that misconception that it's only in third world countries and it really doesn't happen here on a large scale, that's true, but it still happens on a massive scale internationally as well. The recruitment methods, all children are vulnerable. This is something that everybody needs to understand, is that this is a crime that cuts across every socioeconomic, every gender, every race. It is across the board. It doesn't discriminate, which is what Richard was referring to. We're in a very good part of town here in Tennessee, and yet we're still talking about human trafficking and how it affected that small town this week. But here are some of the methods of recruitment. Like we've heard earlier, that Romeo, or we call it the lover complex, that's probably the number one way that trafficking happens. And those are the recruitment methods that are used, especially online. You've heard a lot of people talk about online and how that's increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. in our time at home during 2020 especially, and will continue to grow. The thing about the internet, though, that I want to bring out, I'll just tell you about a little bit of a case study that we had just this last year in 2020, was a young girl who was raised in a very prominent middle-class family, and went to church, went to a private Christian school, and yet she was still right here. And she went to a private Christian school here in Southeast Nashville, and is currently going to a college in Nashville. And she was trafficked on the line from the time she was in 8th grade all the way until she's now a sophomore at our local university here in Nashville. And her parents and her family never knew about this. And that's because this person friended her simply on Facebook, and then began to create that romance and that promise of love and acceptance, posed himself as somebody her age, when in turn our investigators have found out that it's a much older gentleman. And but she did this inside of her own home without anybody knowing about it. And so to me, I think if we don't get anything else across to you, especially with the internet and things that are happening right now and how secluded our children are at home, remember, just because you have a safe home and just because you created a safe environment for your children doesn't mean that when they're 12, 13, and 14, that little brain wants to be loved, wants to be needed, wants to feel pretty, wants to feel accepted. And when they're not going to school, or when they're not feeling that in other places, they're going to seek it in the wrong places. And so this young girl, for example, was, trafficked for almost 8 years of her life right out of her own home. And it started off just being a picture that she was blackmailed with, that she sent this person. And then it went to full-blown scale. She was having to get on the webcam and perform for this person. And luckily, we have people like Hope for Justice and Rescue One. We have our own investigative team that we use, and they can find and prosecute these people. But that's very important. I know Sarah's going to talk about that here in a second, is the prosecution, because we will never arrest our way out of this problem. We'll never rescue our way out of this problem if we don't prosecute, change the laws, and put people away. That really is where we're going to be able to address this side of the demand and those that are perpetrating this issue. But that's how they come in. Those perpetrators come in and they recruit them, and they offer them things like food, shelter, clothing. Sometimes they use their position of authority in doing so. I know of youth pastors and school teachers and coaches and lawyers, and you name it, they're the perpetrators. They look just like all the other people that you walk across and see every day in your life. And victims look just that way as well. Here's a few of the red flags of human trafficking you might see out there and come across. And some people have already talked about these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But those unexplained injuries, I will say red flags of human trafficking very much mirror domestic violence situations. So quite often, as Kelly said earlier, being a nurse, and in there, sometimes nurses and doctors will obviously be the ones who have some of the most access to some of these victims. And you may see things and you may chalk it up to, law enforcement may chalk it up to being a drug habit or some other type of crime, or doctors and nurses may chalk it up to being a domestic violence situation. And this all depends on how you're going to take that gut feeling that you have and see something, say something, and do something about it. But young girls that you see posting online provocative clothing, inappropriate, types of clothing, especially for the weather situation. We have young girls in our Safe House program where if you look at their pictures of what they were posted online, they look 10 and 15 years older than what they really are. And you'd never know that they're 13 years old. And so online can be very deceiving, and you could pick up those red flags of human trafficking if you look close enough at them. There are also different types of red flags, and I think Kelly already mentioned Hope for Justice, Polaris Project. Lots and lots of great organizations out there have human trafficking red flags. So I just encourage you to Google some really reliable sources, because there's no way we could spend our 15 to 20 minutes here really unpacking what those mean. But for adults and children, you're actually going to have some different types of red flags. Adults' red flags look a little bit different than those for children. But some common things that we're experiencing right here in Davidson County, for instance, in children, is dealing with our, in our schools, our officers that are inside of our schools, truancy. And the idea that a lot of these kids are showing up truant inside of Davidson County here, especially in our school officers are picking up on those things, and are we able to still get back in and reach and help those kids who that might be one of the red flags of human trafficking if they're not showing up, or different things that the teachers are seeing online. And so we're having to twist our ideas right now during the pandemic of what flags we're looking for inside of this for children, so that we could try to reach some of them that we would normally be able to reach when they're engaging with a teacher or a counselor at their schools. But they're getting in trouble. The runaways, Stacia's already referred to that. We at Rescue One here in Nashville work very closely with Epic Girl. I would say that 60% of the girls who have been in our minors who have been in our Safe House program here in Nashville have gone through Epic Girl's program, because even though we find them a safe place here, they're going to still run away. And they're very good at survival, even when they get away from us. And people ask us all the time, like, why would they run? If you create a safe place for them, why would they run? Why do they go back to that? Well, again, a 14-year-old's brain is not yet developed. They literally sometimes can't distinguish between that adrenaline that was fun, and then they forget very rapidly how bad it got. And so they'll go back to it, because not having a phone and not, being able to get on the internet and all your social media, that feels too restrictive for them. And so then they run from that, and they want to get back out there and experience fun and freedom. And then they find themselves in a lot of bad situations again. Most of the girls who run away from our Safe House program end up being re-trafficked and re-exploited within a very, very short period of time of getting back out on the streets. And but when you see those girls that are out there, I challenge people, like, don't prejudge when you're seeing people, homeless people, people who look like they shouldn't be where they are currently at. Find a way to ask them some very, non-threatening questions, and take those red flags seriously, and then be able to hopefully offer them help. One of the things that I'll talk about really quickly before I'm done with my time too is shelters. We here in Nashville and in the Philippines and Thailand, our shelter program is called Grace Oasis. And that's just kind of our place of creating an oasis in the midst of their storm, and providing lots of grace and mercy for them to heal, and lots of grace for them to realize that this is not their fault. They may have made poor choices. And sometimes they do a lot of self-blame, and they have a lot of hopelessness. And so in this place, we want to offer a lot of grace and a lot of mercy, and to tell them that they're valued, and they're not defined by their past mistakes, and they're not defined by what's been done to them, but they're defined by being a priceless treasure, and they're worth all of that. Also, when it comes to shelters, one of the things I'm going to try to show you here, if I can share a different part of my screen for just a second. Let me see if I can pull this up. It's because I know some of you are coming from different places in the country. And you may not, some of us are talking here from Nashville, but you're not here locally. A couple of things about shelters I will say, though, is that sometimes moving a person from their current location of exploitation to a different location gives us a better opportunity for recovery and restoration. The reason for that is that they're familiar with their streets. If we talked about runaways and how that's a big deal. But if you can move them to a different place, then sometimes that unfamiliarity gives them enough reason to stick inside of a restoration program that they can get help. The sad part about shelters, the landscape inside of the U.S., here's two organizations that I work very closely with nationally that you guys, I challenge you to go look up. And if you're looking for help for someone, these are great resources for you to look up. One is the Samaritan Women. They're located in Baltimore, Maryland, right outside of D.C. And if you were to go to their website, this is their website, one of their pages, and it's the shelter map across the states. And if you go onto this map, you can literally click into the areas, and you can zoom in, and you can find who is providing shelter and what types of shelter they're providing for people. So I wanted to make sure that everybody on this call today has a place to go and look for shelters. You're welcome to call us. We offer shelter for minors ages 10 to 17. We're one of the only licensed facilities in the state of Tennessee that is designated specifically for minors. There are other places that minors go and get help, but we are specifically just for human trafficking here in Tennessee. I would say that 90% of our children come from outside of Tennessee for the reason that I stated earlier, and that is so that they could get the help and more likelihood of sticking. The other option that we have for shelter, we have a shelter for adult women, but we also have a shelter for women with their children. That's a very rare thing on this national landscape, is to find a shelter where a woman could bring their little 2-year-old with them and get the help that they need and the restoration that they need without having to be separated from that child. Quite often that child becomes a very, very key part in helping a mom to recover. They give her that drive to keep going. But here's some quick facts that are on this. This Sheltered Institute, we contact all these shelters at least once every couple of months to make sure they're still active. The sad part about the sheltered landscape is, look at these statistics and the facts right here on the bottom of my screen. There's currently only 192 shelters listed inside of our database. There are 10 states with no shelter programs at all in their states. There are 8 states that only have 1 shelter program. The greatest numbers of shelters exist in California. There are only 60 programs in the entire country serving minors, and that could be various forms of serving minors. And programs serving women with children, there's only 29 of us in the entire country. It's not even enough to cover the entire, country in any way, shape, or form. The average amount of beds inside of these facilities are 4 to 6 beds. So if you were to take that number, it's out there, probably about 1,400 to 1,500 beds are available when it comes to shelter care for victims of human trafficking. And so that is a huge need for the landscape, because the restoration of victims is probably the largest, most complicated, long-term, most expensive form of fighting human trafficking. We could sit on a call like this and raise awareness, and all of us go about our daily business, and some of us even forget about what we've heard today. But those of us that are taking care of victims on a 24/7 daily basis, that's a long-term commitment. The other thing I want you guys to see is this is a referral system. You do not have to be a part of this alliance to send someone through this system. So for instance, Kelly said she's in Ohio and she has a young girl, but she doesn't have the resources, for instance, from her hospital to get a person a bed that she needs. You could go on there, Kelly, and you could actually fill out a referral at the National Trafficking Sheltered Alliance, and you can find a bed, and it would send it to every one of us that could possibly help the victim that you are trying to get help for. So I hope that those couple of shelter things help you to understand a little bit more about the sheltered landscape here in the U.S. and what it looks like. Sheltered care is hard. It is very emotional. Our staff and team gets burnout quite often because you're dealing with their compound complex drama and trauma 24/7. And but yet when they feel love, they find hope, and that hope begins to rebirth something inside of them. And there will never be a day that I can say that it's not worth it when I get to look into their eyes and they tell me, thank you, or I didn't know how much I needed help until I got safe and security. And so that's the number one. If you ask anybody in the anti-trafficking world, what does a victim need most? It's safety and security. Once they find safety and security, they'll begin to open up and share with our prosecutors and our law enforcement and our investigators, here's how to go find the person who did this to me. Once they get that safety and security, they'll begin to open up to their therapist and their counselors. And then that's where true healing begins to happen inside of their life. And so, again, if we can help you, you can contact us in any way, shape, or form. Thanks, Richard, for having us. This is a much needed conversation.
So much, Lacey, for sharing your expertise with us. And you made an important point. Restoration's not a 9-to-5 job. And the trauma can be transferred to you and your workers there as well. And it's very, very difficult and heavy to do the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for what you guys do, but the partnership and the coalition we have on here today of working together to combat trafficking. I'd really like to welcome Sarah Wilson to the opportunity to speak. Sarah's from New York and graduated from the University of Notre Dame Law School. But Sarah is at the Nashville District Attorney's Office, where she specifically focuses on human trafficking prosecutions. She also sits on the board of the Tennessee Recovery Foundation, the Human Trafficking Survivors Court Foundation, Thistle Farms Advocacy Group, and she's engaged in multiple community efforts to combat human trafficking. Really appreciate the opportunity to have her and her expertise with us today. She's played a huge part in the coalition to combat human trafficking here locally and nationally too. So thanks, Sarah, for taking time on your Saturday to come with us.
Thank you, Richard. Can everyone hear me? Give me a nod. All right, cool. First of all, I apologize. So I usually have, materials for this, but I'm unable to get into my office right now. It was damaged in the bombing. So I'm going to do my best and answer, as many questions as I can. I really appreciate Richard having me. First of all, I couldn't do any part of my job without the partnerships that I have with the nonprofits here in Nashville. So I frequently reach out to Hope for Justice, to Rescue One, to Epic Girl, and all of them help me to do what I do. I prosecute all of the human trafficking cases that come through Davidson County. I also prosecute all of our promoting prostitution cases, and I'll talk about the difference between those two in a second. These are very hard cases to prosecute. They're not easy for various reasons, which I'll also touch on. And it's so important that we have education, because the bottom line is jurors are people that we pull from the community. And if you're sitting on a jury, somebody here in this group, you are going to be equipped to help understand what trafficking is, whereas somebody else who's had no education on what human trafficking looks like would have a much harder time understanding the case that I would put in front of them. So to me, education is such an important part, such an important element of being able to prosecute traffickers appropriately. So I appreciate this opportunity. So first of all, I'll talk a little bit about the laws that we have in Tennessee for trafficking. First of all, we do have laws against promoting prostitution. That's sort of your, when there is no force, fraud, or coercion, you will have an adult who is choosing to engage in sex for money, and there is somebody who's facilitating that process. People that we think of as pimps. That could involve them buying the hotel rooms, transporting them, setting up the dates for them. But there's no element of force, fraud, or coercion in that. So we call that promoting prostitution, and it's an felony offense. And it does make you, it's a mandatory sex offender registration offense as well. Any time that there is a juvenile involved, it is human trafficking. So there are no juvenile prostitutes. I cannot stress that enough. That law changed too recently. It used to be that we would classify juveniles as prostitutes, and we would prosecute adults who were taking advantage of them for, promoting prostitution. That doesn't happen anymore. We understand that juveniles cannot consent. They are not prostitutes. There's no such thing. So anytime that there is a juvenile who is involved in commercial sex, we will prosecute that as human trafficking. Human trafficking is a B felony unless it occurs within 1,000 feet of a school zone, which would make it an A felony. And there are other ways, there are other enhancement factors as well. When I say anytime a juvenile is involved, I don't just mean if there's like a promoter or a trafficker. If we have a buyer, if we have what we call a John, somebody who is seeking sex with a minor, we will also prosecute that person for human trafficking. So anytime that somebody is engaged in sex for money with a minor, we can prosecute that person for human trafficking on any end. So that's one of the ways that Tennessee has really forward-thinking laws about what human trafficking really looks like. One of the things that I see very, very often, and I should mention, when a juvenile is involved, I do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion for human trafficking. So I just have to prove that this juvenile was involved in basically sex for money or for a benefit. When it is an adult, and we're looking at prosecuting human trafficking with an adult victim, then I am looking at having to prove force, fraud, or coercion. So the difference between a human trafficking case and a promoting prostitution case, when I have an adult victim, is that I'm looking at, was this victim forced, coerced or fraudulently induced to commit these commercial sex acts. Force, fraud, and coercion in Tennessee, we have really broadened that definition to kind of honor what we often see in these cases. So what I very often see with adults is that there is somebody addicted to drugs and a trafficker is exploiting their access to those drugs by having them engage in sex for money, and then they will facilitate the distribution of this person's drugs. Explicitly in the statute for human trafficking in Tennessee, we do include drugs and withholding drugs as a method of coercion. Now, for me as a prosecutor, like I said, that is the thing I see the most often. That is the number one way that I have adult victims who are being coerced is through drugs. Now, if you're sitting on a jury and you've seen the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, where, goes in and girl gets snatched and they shoot her up and she's being sold out of, a basement. And then I get up and tell you, this is actually human trafficking too. And it is, and I have a victim who may not even be present. If he or she is present, they may, be just still struggling with addiction. They may not have a perfect criminal record. And I'm expecting a jury to understand that that is also human trafficking. Obviously, that's very challenging, an uphill climb, because that story is not as palatable to society as the story of a kid who's ripped out of her front lawn and, forced into this. I think a couple people touched on this, but most often I do see situations where the victim can leave. They have a cell phone a lot of the time. They have access to other people, but there is something that is keeping the victim with their trafficker. Oftentimes, the traffickers that I see in Davidson County are people that the victim loves or trusts. And with juveniles, 99% of my cases are runaway girls. What does that mean? So I have numerous cases where the trafficker is somebody who the victim was intimately involved with. I have a husband and wife case currently where the husband was trafficking the wife. I have a lot of caretaker cases. So a juvenile typically who's being trafficked by their caretaker, somebody that they trust, that they live with, be it their mother or an aunt or an uncle. And then for runaway juveniles, most often I see young girls who are meeting men online, whether it be through Instagram, Facebook, some of these dating sites, these text apps. I even had a girl who met her trafficker through PlayStation chat. So again, I see plenty of cases in Davidson County. I am not bored at all. And that kind of comes as a surprise to some people because, when you think about human trafficking in a city like Nashville, you're thinking, well, how many cases could you possibly have? Well, the answer is a lot. And part of that is because we have such inclusive laws about what human trafficking looks like. Now, in terms of the buyer end, in terms of John's, patronizing prostitution is an A misdemeanor. So the demand element of things gets a little bit more complicated. Like I said, if you patronize or seek sex for money with a juvenile, we can charge you with human trafficking. But if you patronize prostitution from an adult, you're facing an A misdemeanor. And in Davidson County, we allow you to take a class, pay $350, get STD tested, and then that charge can be dismissed and expunged. We offer a similar class for women who have been charged with prostitution, which is a B misdemeanor. And I help to run that class for women who have been charged with prostitution. And one of the things that I say when I speak at the John School is I say, I am face-to-face with these women almost every day. So if you think that when you buy sex from somebody, anybody, even an adult, that it's a pretty woman style, she really wants it too, you are absolutely wrong. I think probably somewhere in the range of 90% of the women that I work with on the survivor side have had a serious trauma in their past that's led them to be, number one, vulnerable to a trafficker, or number two, for adults, engage in prostitution. So it's not this pretty woman story. And that's something that I have to frequently explain at the John School. So that's sort of where our laws stand here in Nashville. When it comes to actually functionally prosecuting these cases, they are very, very hard. A couple of reasons. Number one, trauma bonding. So all of my victims, for the most part, experience some level of trauma bonding with their trafficker. So what that looks like is, even after they have made it to a safe space, usually with the help of some of the people on this panel, they feel a guilt, or they still feel a love towards the person that was trafficking them. That makes it very hard to keep a victim on board with prosecution. These cases take a very long time to prosecute. From start to finish, a case could take up to 2 years. Often, like I said, I often don't take these to jury trials, especially when I have a juvenile involved. I try to avoid a jury trial if I can. There's a lot to be said about re-traumatizing. It is without the help of our local nonprofits who help to provide services and stabilization for survivors, I would not have any shot at any of these cases at all. But from time to time, I'll get a victim, a survivor who is on board and stays on board. However, then that leads us to barrier number 2, which I touched on before, which is getting a judge, a jury, even a defense attorney to understand what human trafficking really looks like. So that's a barrier all on its own, is explaining to even a judge, even people who are well-versed in the law, and a jury is a whole other thing, but explaining that human trafficking is not how it looked 10 years ago. It's not how it looked 5 years ago. And it's not how it looks in the movies all the time. So facilitating a situation in which I can get the outcome that I want means a lot of education, a lot of talking, a lot of looking at the law, looking at how the law has changed, looking at the legislative history of the laws. And we have developed laws, and we still are developing laws that honor the journey of a survivor better, but it's not perfect. So that's something that I also feel very passionately about working on, is advocacy, legislative advocacy. And I'm not going to talk for too much longer, but the last thing I kind of want to touch on is a couple of, and I'm not going to use any names or identifying information, but a couple of the things that I have on my plate right now. I am about to have a sentencing hearing with a 16-year-old girl whose mother was trafficking her mother, and was exploiting her with photos. I have numerous cases of juveniles with their caretakers. I have a husband and wife where the husband was exploiting the wife using her children. And I have, I'm trying to think of some more of my unique ones. I mean, I have, like I said, the bulk of my cases are women who have been exploited with the use of drugs. And I have a bunch of high-risk runaway juvenile victims right now. So those are some of the things on my plate right now. Again, I don't have any, I have exactly one juvenile male victim currently. So when I say women, it doesn't mean that men do not get trafficked. They absolutely do. Men and young boys absolutely get trafficked. But there are other issues with disclosure and identification in that realm. So when I say women and girls, that's because that's for the most part what I have on my plate. So that's all I got. I'm looking forward to questions at the end. And thank you again, Richard.
Yeah, Sarah, to follow up on that, I think we've yet to see the statistics and the effects of COVID until hopefully after it's over with. But, there's this huge anticipation that these cases are going to come flowing in after COVID. What's your opinion on the online exploitation rise pending the COVID outcome?
Sure. So I think COVID has created sort of a very challenging environment in the prosecution realm, because we don't have the same tools available to us that we usually use, especially involving kind of in-person intervention. I think that, like a couple people have already touched on, kids right now are sitting at home on their computers all of the time. I'm already seeing, for a couple of months, I was seeing 0 new cases, nothing. And already in the past couple of weeks, I've gotten probably 10 new cases in the past couple weeks that I'm working on. So I would say that probably at some point when we are kind of able to get back in person, see each other more, there will be probably an influx of some disclosures that are going on. People seemed to think that, traffickers would not want to engage in this behavior because it's, the added layer of risk of getting COVID. But I'm here to tell you that it's not, they don't care. So I am anticipating that when we are able to get vulnerable people back in front of services, that we will have disclosures at an increased level.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you just brought up, that traffickers don't take a holiday and they don't abide by COVID restrictions. So, okay, so that really concludes the panel discussion. At this point, I'm going to turn the question and answers over to Mrs. Dowell with the links, and she'll be facilitating the questions for everyone. Before this chat is over, I will post the names of the panel participants and their email addresses so that you can feel free to contact them for more information if you seek more information on Epic Girl or on Rescue One Global or Hope for Justice or Lily Pad Haven, or some clinical aspects from Dr. Clunan.
Thank you, Richard, and thank all the participants today. I just want to make a note is that I know several people were not able to hop on to our Zoom call today. I think there were some limitations in the number of people who could join. We set this up for 100 people, and we actually had double the amount of people to register and want to participate. We had quite a few people in our medical community and also in our faith-based community that were very interested in learning more about human trafficking and how they can be part of the solution. So I do hope that we can gather this group back together again to host an additional session if that's possible, so that we can allow all of those who were not able to join us this morning to have an opportunity to get this great information and to interact with you one-on-one, to ask questions and find out how they can help. With that being said, I will open up the floor for questions for people who are participating in our Zoom call today. Is there anyone with any questions? If not, I'll get us started. One question I've been asked a lot is how can we as nonprofit organizations like the Links and several other organizations in our cities partner and help groups who are working to tackle this horrific crime in the community? Are there some specific things that we can do on the realms of policy, perhaps, or maybe volunteering, or to help with these organizations? So if you're able to talk on that topic, I'll just start us off with that.
I can actually speak on that. This is Benjinis with Lily Pad. Actually, here we're in Charlotte, North Carolina area, and are working with the one of the Links chapters here. And one of the things the organization has done is provide vision board, a party or group to help with empowering the survivors. We've partnered with a doctor that can talk about certain health concerns that the survivors may have. Working with, you may have someone in your agency, in your organization that might be a social worker, might be a psychologist, someone that could maybe assist with some psychotherapy groups that may have some background in doing that. There's always just some volunteering efforts around maybe the agency's properties, maybe things that the guests may need, or the clients or survivors may need. Just different things like that to give you an example of what is being done here in the Charlotte area.
And I can also touch on sort of the advocacy part of things here in Nashville. I think that if anybody has any kind of connections to your local legislator, it's really important to kind of look at, and I'm happy to help in this realm. You can shoot me an email. There are laws currently as they stand that are meant to assist survivors of human trafficking, and they are not perfect. In fact, some of them are sort of non-functional at this point. So on for an advocacy standpoint, if that's something that people are interested in, please email me, because I'm working with Thistle Farms. They've created an advocacy board that I'm part of, and we are working towards sort of seeing if we can inspire some change in that realm.
Hey, it's Stacia. I would say if you're local in Nashville, we train about 150 to 200 women to date on mentoring. And so if mentoring is something that you have time for from a prevention standpoint, it's a really important piece to building a buffer to keeping girls from becoming victims of something like human trafficking or other risks that may lead to negative outcomes. So you can go to epicgirl.net and sign up to be a mentor, and then Antonise from our organization would contact you for training.
And I think, Jacobia, having events just like what we're having today to bring this awareness to I mean, there's 100 people on this call today. We've effectively reached 100 people, minus the speakers, of course. But, you know, education leads to awareness, and awareness leads to rescue. I mean, we know that. And I think it's important that we continue to do events just like this. And so if you are a member of this this call and you belong to an organization, whether it's a civic organization, whether it's a job that's in a relevant area that would need to be trained, contact anybody on the panel. I've put everybody's email address on there. I don't think any of us care who trains who. We're happy to do it jointly. We're happy to do it individually. The fact is that you get trained, and so that you spread the awareness. And I think it's important for each one of these sectors where trafficking is most relevant gets educated, like the clinical setting, like hotels and motels, so the hospitality industry, the financial industry, certainly the banking system. So when we look at each one of these sectors of business that human trafficking affects, obviously it affects everything, but more some than others. Those people need to be trained, and spreading awareness like what you're doing today, what the Links Incorporated has done today, is a huge impact in what we can do to try to start combating trafficking.
And somebody mentioned earlier the faith-based community. Rescue One is a faith-based organization, and our secondary mission, besides obviously fighting human trafficking, is to mobilize churches into this work. Working with our government agencies and our non-government agencies, all of us would probably say that the church and faith-based communities become one of our best resources for reaching out and finding volunteers and finding some of the things that you've heard each one of these other ladies and Richard talk about today that you can help us with. But if for those of us that have an actual program and care, there's all kinds of just everyday basic needs. If you use it in your home, then we have to have it in our Safe House program, for instance. If you use it on a regular basis, we need those types of things as well. So doing drives, setting up a box in your local bank or in your church foyer or in your office complex or something like that, and collecting feminine products or basic necessities. Any of us that have programs and reach out, I mean, even Sarah Wolfson, even though she's in the DA's office with Cherished Hearts, they can use those products when they have those classes as well. So you can take it from the very practical all the way to the big scale, like Richard said, to awareness events. All of us on this panel, I know almost everybody, and we can all talk to a handful of people. We can talk to hundreds of people all at the same time. And we love to be able to do that as well. So
I just want to add to that, just take some kind of action. So whether that's a financial support, I know I love Hope for Justice has a guardian program that you can help support somebody who is, you're helping in some way. It's $18 a month, or maybe you want to give $5 today to somebody. I mean, I think just doing something. I know for me early on, I felt like this is such a hard topic, and I was scared to be a part of it because it literally breaks my heart. And I just think that it's important, though, to take action. And I think that feeling action and feeling power behind that has changed my life, because it has allowed me to help stop it. And even though it's a horrible thing, it's what drives me, and now makes me feel like I can't stop doing something for this, whatever it is, whether I keep teaching, donating, whatever. So just do something. Every single thing helps. Like they're saying, starting a drive, giving some money, teaching someone, telling your friend about this, all of that does something. So I would just do what you're comfortable with, or maybe not comfortable with and want to push yourself a little, but something that triggered you today, do it. Just do it.
Thank you. I had another question that came up in the chat. We had a gentleman ask, what happens to the victims after they're rescued or saved? So are any of you able to speak to that, and maybe talk a little bit about how many women, or any type of a percentage of how many women actually go back into trafficking after they're rescued, or what type of outcomes do you have through your organizations?
I'm happy to give kind of from my standpoint of things, which is that we have, because I also sit on the staff for a court for women who have been trafficked. I will say this: once you've been trafficked once, you become extremely vulnerable to re-traumatization and re-trafficking. And part of that has to do with entry into the system. And we, like I said, our nonprofits here, Stacia and Lacey and Hope for Justice, doing an incredible job of supporting survivors. But like Lacey and Stacia both touched on, especially for juveniles who don't have a fully developed brain yet, they will run away again. So what happens after a rescue is largely dependent on who the survivor or who the victim is. Often, and again, sort of also what their situation was. So after somebody is, let's say, rescued, if they're a juvenile, most of the time they'll be put in, DCS will get involved, and they'll hopefully connect with somebody like Stacia or Lacey. And after that, the reunification with a family is always the goal. So maybe they go back to their home. What I see at that point is usually we lose them again. With adults, if they have an addiction, we work to get people into safe housing, long-term safe housing. But the bottom line is, we don't lock up survivors, so they are always able to leave again. And unfortunately, many, many times they do. And it can take multiple times in a survivor's life for them to actually commit to safety and commit to rehabilitation and all of that. So that's sort of my answer from the end of seeing people, continue to show up on my end.
And I would say that there is an estimate out there that it takes 5 to 7 times for somebody to be rescued and to go into some type of programming. And it's all about their willingness to put the effort forth. And it really has, when we first started our Safe House program, it was so defeating to take in a girl and then have her run away and then go pick her back up at juvenile detention center and enroll her in Epic Girl. And then she runs away again. And, our staff and our team became very, very defeated over and over again. We had one girl who ran away in 2020, early 2020, 11 times. and ended up having, she was a witness for Homeland Security in another state, and they ended up having to take her and lock her up because of we couldn't keep her safe from herself. And so there is no magic number. And then all of a sudden, the last 3/4 of 2020, we've had 0 runaways. So you just don't know. It really has to do with their circumstances. Our program didn't change. Our people didn't change from January to August. And so to say that we had 3 girls run away in the first 9 weeks of 2020, and then we had no girls run away in the last 9 months, you just don't know who's going to stick and who isn't. But what we tell our girls is this: we'll always come back for you. You can always call us. I don't care if you run away 5 times. We're going to show back up the 6th time and the 7th time and the 11th time and pick you up. And even if you get older and you're an adult now and you find yourself in a situation, there are always people to call. And so that's really the thing, is about us showing up, unconditional, no strings attached love and care. And at some point it'll click with them. At some point, a large portion of them will stick, but there's no good statistics on that as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'll say recidivism rates are certainly a challenge for this population. One of the things that I've been talking with Sarah a lot about, and think I've even had some conversation with Rescue One about it, is looking at stages of rehabilitation, so that, because we really do have to consider stabilization. And it's very difficult to take someone that's been on the streets, that's even maybe before they became a victim of trafficking, they were I have girls all the time that'll say, I don't need DCS, or I don't need anyone to help me. I've been raising myself since I was 8. And so there's that independence where they really don't feel like they need someone. And, there's a lot of laws that Kelly might know from a healthcare perspective around mental health, where there's a certain age where girls can decline treatment. And because our laws are very geared towards seeing girls and boys that have been victimized as victims, we can't lock them up, and they're not stabilized yet to form those attachments. So Lacey is very, very right that sometimes the best thing we can do for them is to give them the opportunity for connection and continue to reach out. I mean, I feel bad a lot of times that I'll see, I think I saw your runaway, and all of the Epic Girls saw your runaway that ran 11 times. And there comes a point when we all have to have a conversation that says, this is dangerous for the other girls that you're serving, because when you take someone that's destabilized and that's not stabilized at all, and put them in an environment with girls that may be somewhat stabilized, then you destabilize the whole environment. And so you're starting over, which is why we see girls where you'll have, I've seen residential programs go from 100% full to 100% empty in 72 hours. Because the stabilization factor is very important. So those are things that, that's one reason collaboration is so important, because even though I'm not working specifically in residential treatment, working with the runaways and understanding those trauma bonds and things like that, it's important for us to start petitioning people, looking at levels of stabilization and step down and continuity of care, because that really is the only way we're going to get good numbers.
And one last thing, just a little bit of encouragement. I love the founder of Hope for Justice, Ben Cooley, has a book called Impossible is a Dare. And I'm sorry if you can hear my son in the background. But it's kind of loud back there. But that book is so inspiring to me, because he talks about the victims and he talks about some stories, but then he tells you about what happens after in some of those, and the freedom that some of these people have, and the fact that the children can play again, that these people end up going on to get married and have children. So although I hear that there's, a struggle, and sometimes it's 5 or 6 times, be encouraged, because it does make a difference and there are people saved. And I encourage all of you on this call to read that book, because I just feel like it's been a good perspective for me, just to think of, gosh, what do these people experience after? What I can't even imagine, like, can they ever move on, right? How do you do that? And so to see that side of it, and to see that, yes, like they move forward and they have this ability to find freedom and live free, and it's very encouraging. Oh.
And it is. Just listening to the different organizations, one of the things that we do, we are providing a place for the victims to get some type of assistance and support. We may not see the change. We may not see, the outcome all the time, but it's about being there to support the victims, planting that seed. It may take 5 times, but that first time made a change in that survivor or that victim of human trafficking. So not stopping, keep doing the work, keep making a difference, and working with the survivors. Trauma changes the brain, and it may take several times for a victim to learn how to cope and move through some of those traumatic experiences, and just starting with forgiving themselves first. So yeah, they run away several times. We work with survivors 18 and older, and it's no different from even with the younger survivors. Even when they say they're ready, they still may not quite be ready. So just keep doing the work and not giving up, and just keep planting those seeds and making a difference. It's so important.
I'd also say if you're interested in understanding vulnerable youth, Centoya Brown's story is very compelling for someone that was, spent a lot of time in the juvenile justice system and was in and out of residential programs, and then ended up doing 15 years in jail. And the Centoya Brown Long, and it's Free Centoya is her book. And then, I always point people to some of well, she has a documentary, and there's also a series on, I think it's Netflix, called Girls Incarcerated. And I think it's such an amazing snapshot of the struggles of some of the young girls that we see that really do desire connection, and how when they have connection, it really can change everything. And I appreciate what you say about planting seeds, because I think we tell our mentors and staff all the time that sometimes we plant the seeds and then we pray for other people to come along and water and nurture, and it really does take us all. So thank you for saying that.
Thank you for all the wonderful comments and all the great information. It is now 12 o'clock, and we're at the end of our presentation today, but I want to specifically thank all of you for participating, especially Richard for working with our Links chapter to put together this educational seminar, as well as Stacia with Epic Girl, Benjanis with Lily Pad Haven. And it's great to hear that our sisters in Charlotte are working and partnering with you to support your wonderful organization, as well as Lacey and Kelly, and also Sarah. We definitely appreciate the work that you do down at our district attorney's office, helping to eradicate this crime in our community. So on behalf of our Links chapter, I just want to thank all of you. And again, I can't stress enough that the interest in this educational seminar today was just overwhelming. So I do hope that all of you would be willing to join again in the near future, and let's host another session so that we can invite more people within our community to participate. Our Links chapter or the other organizations across the Nashville area and Middle Tennessee area are looking to partner and see how we can work together to make sure that this doesn't happen in our community. And so we have a lot of active people now who are very interested. So we hope that we can continue having these educational seminars and also partnering together and working together to rid our community of this. So with that being said, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. And I hope, again, for us to get together soon to have another conversation. Thank you and have a good day.
Thanks, Jacobia.
Thank you.